soldiers are going to be victorious, and they just got the crap kicked out of them in that battle. And it's actually sort of, I was reading through, letters and diaries written by some of the mercenaries, right, the Hessian mercenaries during that battle. And, one of them, one of the commanders is like, among the prisoners, there's many so-called colonels, lieutenant colonels, majors, and other officers. They're nothing but mechanics, tailors, shoemakers, wig makers, barbers. Some of them were soundly beaten by our people who would by no means let such persons pass for officers, right? And that convinced Washington that you really there's a place for expertise, like the moral sentiment is important, but you also need expertise. So we've kind of gone back and forth in this, and for a long time there's been this idea that there's something kind of wrong with a professional soldier, right? Ulysses S. Grant felt this way, right? That like the men who signed up for the Civil War were great, but the other people who career soldiers, not so much. Now we have an all volunteer military, right? And you do still have some of that sentiment sometime that, maybe people are only joining the military because they've got no other options in life. I was at an event with a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who basically said that to me. But for the most part, the military has this huge support and approval right now. And it is kind of assumed that we are citizen soldiers, that we are inspired by, devotion to the Republic and to the set of ideals that we're fighting for. And yeah, so in that piece, I kind of go through the different conceptions of the soldier. And I think that it is an interesting place to be where you have very strongly operative the notion that, soldier in the modern military should be a citizen soldier. We'd like to consider them in that way. We'd like to consider that they are fighting for our ideals. That's part of the oath that we swear, right? We don't swear to, a set of boundaries. We don't swear to a flag. We swear to defend the Constitution, right? We are bound by a set of principles that we're swearing to. And yet at the same time, it's an all-volunteer force, and it's very separate from American society as a whole. And it's sort of the numbers of people in the military, you're already talking about a fraction of a percentage of the American public, but it's geographically clustered as well. So, and it's increasingly a family business where if your parents were in the military, you're much more likely to be in the military. And so, where I live in New York, every once in a while I'll run into somebody who's never met a modern veteran before, veteran of the current wars, or at least not knowingly so. And that's just a very strange place to be in.
And so back to the implicit moral contract idea, do you think that that's changing now, the contract between America and its soldiers?
Right. So, the contract should be like, we fight the wars, we take, the soldier is going to take on the immediate sort of physical burdens, mental burdens, many of the kind of moral burdens and spiritual burdens that one encounters in a war zone. And then, the American public is supposed to be responsive to the care of the returning veteran when they come home, which I think actually we've done a relatively good job at, right? So there's clearly, areas where we're not doing particularly well. But more than that, provide effective oversight of the wars, right? If you consider going to war as one of the most morally momentous things that a nation can do, that is something that should engage the citizenry. It is one where we have an added obligation to to scrutinize the decisions of our policymakers. And in a weird way, what policymakers often want to do when we're at war is use the fact that we're at war to tell civilians that they are supposed to take a backseat, right? That they're not supposed to intervene, that they should just listen to the generals, that, I remember General Kelly, back when he was still in the Marine Corps, before he was Donald Trump's chief of staff, giving a speech about how, the chattering classes who've never been in the arena think they have a right to talk about it, and you can't support the war, support the troops and not support the war. And I think that kind of rhetoric is really poisonous, right? The idea that, you're not supposed to have a rich political debate back home about wars is noxious to me, because that is precisely, of all things that a nation's going to do, that's one of the areas where you're supposed to have the most robust debate, because if you don't have that, then we as a nation are not going to be, one, providing our troops with an articulation of what we're doing and what our purpose is. Two, we're not going to be scrutinizing the policymakers sufficiently, right, when they make mistakes. And three, our sort of bowing out of that debate will make it clear to the soldier that we don't care, right? That it is not ultimately something that concerns us, right? If I'm not allowed in the discussion about war, then that means I'm not really responsible for it, right? You can't have it both ways. Mm-hmm. This point Lauren DeJong-Schulman made on Twitter today about McMaster's comments that I referenced earlier. She said, "I'm mildly sympathetic to McMaster's opinion on the U.S. role in Afghanistan, but I would remind him that not a soul has stood before a podium and been honest about realistic U.S. objectives and sustainable successes there. This McMaster take is slightly related to a fear I have about the field. We've made national security faux technocratic rather than politically informed. Thus, credentialed NatSec views and action are correct, and worse, opposing positions are either unsaid or poorly supported." And, war is... It's too important to be left to the generals and the politicians and the experts, right? Like it is something that if you're going to do, the nation needs to be engaged in, because if you don't have a robust debate, what hope do you have of having good policy ultimately, right? And I think that you can see that very clearly as in what has happened. We've ceased to make the case for what we've doing. And so you kind of have these sort of perpetual complaints. When I was writing the piece on for the Atlantic on the plunging morale of service members, I had sort of assembled a list of quotes of senior leaders in the military, the Department of Defense, who were basically arguing that we were underfunding non-military tools of foreign power that were essential to military success. And at a certain point, like, the paragraph that was just quotes of like secretaries of defense, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, CENTCOM commanders of the troops in Afghanistan, Iraq, like the list of just people who had said the same thing over the course of years, was just like thousands of words worth of just, complaining going into a void. So, I think that it's... And then more than that, it's not just about having good policy. It's about the fact that we're a democracy, right?
So we had two questions come in from TYFYS guest and listener and patroness saint Corey Shockey, who wants to know what you're working on now as far as your writing. We'll do that one first.
Sure. I'm a big fan of Corey Shockey. Very cool. So I just turned in a novel about, it follows four main characters, two American, two Colombian. It starts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then sort of all the plot lines intersect in Colombia. So, and then goes to another conflict. So it spans from about 2002 to 2016. The basic idea of it is, I guess I could say it's about the U.S. role in Colombia, but more generally about how America projects power on the world. So Colombia is a kind of interesting country to look at. So every ambassador that we've sent to Colombia post 9/11 has become involved with the war in Afghanistan in some way. Two ambassadors to Colombia have gone on immediately afterwards to be the ambassador to Afghanistan. One has gone on to be the ambassador to Pakistan. You have folks who have spent time in Afghanistan and going to Colombia. And it's a country where we've had It's been the largest recipient of military aid in the Western Hemisphere since the end of the Clinton administration, and it's also considered a success case, right? So if you compare the sort of violent deaths in Colombia now versus 15 years ago, it's dramatically less. And the FARC, this communist guerrilla group, recently signed a peace treaty with the government. And it's a counterinsurgency, counter-narcotics fight with high-value targeted assassination. And so kind of tactics and techniques and things that were employed in Colombia would then try to be imported to Afghanistan. And at the same time, things that sort of were developed overseas would get imported back to Colombia. So, for example, there's a way of doing targeting, right, of bringing people from different agencies all together in the same room, variety of other things that was employed in a smaller scale in the hunt for Pablo Escobar, gets used in the Balkans, and then sort of famously in Iraq from 2004 to 2006, Stanley McChrystal and Flynn sort of bring it to an industrial scale. So, Joint Special Operations Command goes from doing about 12 raids a month in 2004 to doing about 250 a month in 2006. That's not because, the Navy SEALs went to the gym and got real buff and, drank more protein shakes. It's because the whole way that we did sort of the kind of system behind that, right, changed, right? And that system is, I think, something that's hard to talk about because it's not necessarily a unit or a technology, but rather sort of a way in which all of those things get sort of, or tactic, but a way that all those things get brought together. And it's really important. Most people, when they think about sort of, Navy SEALs or special operators, they think it's kind of cool, right? The Navy SEAL raid on bin Laden. Most people, when they think about drones, think that they're kind of creepy. But from the perspective of the kind of targeting system, that's just a flathead and Phillips head screwdriver right at the end of that system. Mm-hmm. That system can be brought to other countries too. We aided the Colombians in doing high value targeting against leaders of the guerrilla groups. So anyway, it was a way for me to talk about not just sort of Iraq and not just Afghanistan and not just Colombia, but the ways in which these conflicts are interconnected. And so it's a novel, and that's the basic idea of the novel, is to sort of track characters moving through different conflicts and the way that those things combine in Colombia around the time that the peace treaty is being signed. So, there's a journalist, and she starts out in Afghanistan. There's a American Special Forces guy. You meet him in Iraq. There's a Colombian Special Forces guy, and then a kid who grows up in like a really poor department in Colombia, and his town is subject to a massacre by the FARC, and then he ends up in the paramilitares, and then sort of all those plot lines intersect in this one little province in Colombia.
When can we expect it to come out?
I have no idea. I just turned it in, so,
okay. That's very cool. We'll be looking forward to it. And then on that note...
way more long-winded explanation than you wanted.
No, it's okay. Yeah, it was super interesting. And on that note, we were wondering if you could tell us your top 5 essential war novels.
Also a question from Dr. Shockey.
So Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman would definitely be in there. It's a great book, sort of like a war and peace for the 20th century. Grossman was a journalist with the Red Army. He was at the Battle of Stalingrad. Then he writes this sort of magnificent novel that goes, takes you to sort of scientists in Moscow, people in the Battle of Stalingrad. There's a section on the Nazi death camps that is unbelievably intense and just phenomenal piece of work. It's one of those novels like, sort of people look at it and they're like, do I really want to read a 900-page Russian novel set in Stalinist Russia? Yes, you do. It's like if you start, just start it in a certain point, you will not be able to stop reading it. It is incredible. I mean, does that all have to be novels? Like I would think of David Jones in Princess, which is just it's an incredible modernist poem that gets you so just intensely close to the strangeness of the level of perception of somebody in World War I.
Jones said he wanted his poetry to be incarnational. And that is